Oh, and we're going live. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the last presentation of today in the ping track. I hope you liked all the others before that. And now a short word from our sponsors. You've probably heard this 4 times today already, but the most active participants will win an ebook from our sponsors pack. So use the Q&A functions to ask our speaker, Steve, anything you like about his presentation, or maybe something else, but I think it would be better if you would keep on point. And now I would like to introduce Steve Hoeg, who is from Canada and is working with Maxon. And he's here to tell us about Deming's management philosophy for tester teams. So Steve, go ahead.
Thanks so much. So a few years ago, when I was working on improving the quality of some of the products that I was working on at the time, one name came up again and again, and that's Deming. Many of you have probably heard the name Deming associated with quality, and he's often referred to as the father of quality. And so I wanted to explore a little bit about what he actually taught about quality and how it's relevant to modern software teams. Deming traveled around the country doing 4-day seminars, and what these were his way of introducing different companies and industries to his methodologies. Well, as part of these seminars, one of the experiments that he did was bring a number of volunteers up on stage and performed what he called the Red Bead Experiment. You can find videos of him doing this live on YouTube, and I'd encourage any of you to watch that after. But the basic premise is that we have a box with a number of balls in it, or beads in it, and they're different colors mixed white and red, as you can see here. The volunteers are then given the instructions that the red balls are defective and they're to be avoided at all costs. He gave the volunteers very specific instructions about the angle to scoop at, how they're going to be counted after, and so on. And so he tried to make it a very robust work experience that leaves little deviation. After having a few of the volunteers do a few scoops of balls, he then graphed how well each of them did. And you can see a sample result here. He's rather disappointed though, and most of the volunteers produced quite a few defective items, even though they were given instructions to avoid those red balls. There also was a large variance in the number that the different people produced, with someone like Steve producing only 8, but someone like Pat producing 17. So as any good manager would, he then announces to the volunteers that we're going to do an improvement plan. So he goes around and puts up some posters that say quality first. This is the new initiative that we are announcing, and asks everyone to put an extra effort towards scooping out non-defective items. Second, he sets some goals, and so asks the volunteers to hit below a 5 defective item limit. No more is acceptable. And then finally, he institutes a merit system, adding in bonuses to the people who do best to motivate them, and announces that the worst performers will be fired. After a few more rounds of this experiment, scooping out these beads, he again graphs the results and is disappointed again. On a whole, things don't actually seem all that much different. And worse, someone like Steve, who was the best performer before, now is the worst. Deming did like to teach about statistical methods for understanding processes, and I'm not going to go into the details of these formulas, but the basic idea is that by using a relation of the variance in the different points, we can calculate an upper control limit and a lower control limit that gives us the expected bounds that this system is producing. Anything within these bounds is normal behavior as part of the stable system, and it is only things outside of these points that are the unexpected. And so this is one of the tools that Deming liked to teach to understand how systems work. So what can we learn by this? First, One of the questions that was Deming's favorite to ask in many situations is, by what method? And this really just means that it is important when we're trying to improve something that we have an actual plan how to go about doing that. Setting things like goals isn't actually a plan. It doesn't change the system. It doesn't change the way people work. And so without understanding what method underlies something, you can't necessarily hope that you achieve a different result. Second is understanding that many processes have natural variation, and things like control charts can show what is the normal behavior there. To Deming, it was very important to understand when you should act and when you shouldn't. And it is special causes outside of these control limits where you should take action, not those normal cases within it. And then the final lesson that I think we can take away from the Red Bead experiment is that the focus on individuals and asking people to do better is often ineffective when the majority of the contributions come from the system itself. Deming liked to say that 85% of the output was attributable to the system and not the individuals. And so asking the individuals to have put in better effort often doesn't achieve the result that you'd hope. So who was Deming? Deming was educated as a physicist and mathematician and received his PhD in physics, and then began his career as a statistical consultant. And this is what he did most of his career, consulting for companies on statistics. His life changed rather radically, though, after World War II, where he was enlisted by the army to perform a census on Japan as the effort to rebuild the country was ongoing. As part of his time in Japan, he was introduced to their engineering union, and this union of engineers got him to come talk to many of the companies that were being founded and rebuilt in Japan, to talk to them about statistics and quality methods. Deming made such a huge impact in Japan as part of this that they named the prestigious Deming Prize after him, that's awarded to their companies for quality contributions. What's often not known is that prior to World War II, Japanese products don't have the reputation that they were now known for. Right now, if we think of Japanese products, we think of high tech, high quality, but that wasn't always the case. And in fact, prior to World War II, they were actually rather shoddy and known as often discount products. Deming brought in a different philosophy, and as he toured the country working with many of their industries that were being rebuilt, he taught them that this trade-off between cost and quality was often a false one. In the American automobile industry at the time, the focus was completely on cost, and it was their very much objective to drive that down at all costs. So you'd have them working with their suppliers and trying to negotiate for better prices, even if that meant more defective items coming into the system. Deming believed that this was completely backwards, and it was actually possible to, by increasing the quality, decrease the cost. One thing that he liked to say was that defects are never free. You have to pay someone to produce the product effectively. You have to pay someone to inspect and find that it was defective, and then you have to pay for the rework. And so even though if you get a lower upfront cost for it, the overall cost on the system is often much higher. And so Deming taught instead that the focus should be on quality and constantly improving that. And that over time is what will lead to a decrease in cost. I'm sure many of us have had similar conversations in the software world where we've debated the benefits of investing short-term in things like automated testing and things like that can often have a little upfront cost. But any of us that have worked in a situation where we've had this robust set of automated tests know that it can save us a ton of time in the long run and lead us to be much more productive. Deming's teachings around quality and continuous improvements then directly led towards some of our modern practices that still are popular today. So when you combine his teachings of quality and continuous improvements, which were his fairly unique contributions to the Japanese automobile industry, with the just-in-time manufacturing, you come up with the heart of the Toyota production system, which became lean manufacturing. And of course, that is a direct precursor of the agile software development processes that are prevalent today. And so we can trace a large part of how we create software today back to some of Deming's teachings from the 1950s to these automobile companies. Between the 50s and the 80s, Deming kept teaching his quality methods to Japanese industrialists. And over this time, their car manufacturers completely overtook the American ones in many industries. The Japanese companies, through these methods, were able to achieve both lower cost and higher quality simultaneously. And this led to a real crisis in the American automobile industry, where they just couldn't compete anymore. Deming, however, was relatively unknown in America up to this time. And it was in 1980 that NBC aired a program that was very well received called If Japan Can, Why Can't We? And this highlighted some of the differences between the Japanese and American industries, and had a very prominent featuring of Deming speaking as part of this video. This introduced a lot of Americans to Deming for the first time, and over the next few years, he was introduced to companies like Ford and General Motors and helped them undergo a transformation similar to what he had done in the 50s in Japan. Through the 80s and early 90s, then he distilled a lot of his teachings to these companies and ended up creating 2 books, Out of the Crisis and The New Economics. Unfortunately, I find them a little bit poorly written, and so I'm going to try to cover a lot of what his teachings were for quality today. As we saw in something like the Red Bead Experiment, people are in many ways just the tip of the iceberg. It is the most visible thing, but it often isn't the most effective leverage point for trying to change a company. I remember myself going through agile transformations at companies and repeating over and over again to people, trying to talk them individually into being more agile without looking at all the pieces below the waterline here. Deming was very much about operating on the processes, the culture, and if you want to change something, he very much believed that it is your responsibility as a leader to look below the surface and fundamentally change the way people work. If you do this, that is the right place to focus. Focusing on the people, asking them to work harder, asking them to change is only a very small part of the picture here. When Deming looked at what was happening with many industries, he identified what he called the deadly diseases, which is what he saw as causing significant issue in companies that were operating under old style of management. The first of these is lacking a consistency of purpose, and I really like the phrase consistency of purpose. What Deming meant by this is that, number 1, a company needs to understand why it is in business. Number 2, set a vision for where it wants to head towards improvement. And then number 3, make sure all of its actions are in cohesion with that long-term vision. And this third aspect of cohesion of action with your vision is what I think is really key here. Second is an emphasis on short-term results as the next deadly disease. In many companies, this is about focusing maybe on the profits for the next quarter at the expense of the long-term one. It is in software, maybe underinvesting now in automation and paying for the price for it over the long term. There's many ways which these short-term emphasis can really harm our companies if we're not thinking long-term. Third is the practice of rating employees. And in software companies, we've seen things like stack ranking and companies like Microsoft famously moving away from this. Deming believed that practices like this can absolutely destroy morale. It creates an adversarial relationship where people compete with each other, and it just misses the fundamental facts of what motivates people at work, which usually comes intrinsically. The next deadly disease then is job hopping, and Deming saw this largely a symptom of people not being satisfied at their work. He believed it was very important that everyone find joy at work. And if we don't find a way of motivating people through making their work enjoyable, that we're going to have retention problems. And this led to real issues of knowledge loss at companies. And then his final deadly disease that he saw affecting many companies was an over-reliance on visible metrics. And this one might be a little surprising considering the fact that Deming was a statistician by trade, but he did believe that many of the most important things that a company does are unknown and unknowable. And so while he absolutely advocated that we should be using metrics in many places, we shouldn't have an over-reliance on them because many of the most important things to companies cannot be measured. He liked to say, if you have a happy customer that's going to go tell a number of their friends, how do you measure that? If you have a disgruntled employee who's not pulling their weight in a few ways, how do you measure that? Many of these things are distributed throughout the system and are incredibly hard to measure on their own. And it's usually just these easy metrics that we measure that don't capture the full picture. The flip side of the deadly diseases is the 14 points. And there were two other deadly diseases that Deming identified that were American specific, and so we're not going to cover those here. But the 14 points really crystallized the specific tactics of Deming's management philosophy as to how you do running a modern management philosophy that leads to quality. Deming believed that directly focusing on quality was through things like control charts was only a very small part of achieving quality. Quality instead was an output of the system. And so if you want to improve the quality, you've got to improve the system as a whole. And so the majority of Deming's focus was on how do we well-run teams? If we achieve that, then we will have quality as a byproduct. So the first of the 14 points is creating a consistency of purpose. And again, that was a flip side of one of the deadly diseases. So when we are trying to create change and improvement in our companies, how many of our things are we trying to do the same way that we have always done them? If we want to have a new vision, a new change, if we want to achieve something like increasing our quality, we can't do that with the same old processes that we had before. Instead, we need to adopt this new philosophy and take a look at all 14 points and understand how they can affect every part of running our teams. If we're making decision processes and we're still cramming our releases full of features, that's antithetical if we're trying to improve quality. And so we have to change the way we are doing work by adopting these new points instead of just doing things the way that they were done before. The third of the 14 points is cease an over-reliance on inspection and build quality in early. Deming absolutely believed that inspection testing was very important, but testing and inspection can only reveal problems that have already been created. And so instead, we've got to find ways to move quality earlier in the system. In software, this is things like continuous refactoring, making sure that our code is always clean so creates high quality results. It's about things like accumulating automated tests over years and years. It is code reviews and other practices that create quality early in the process. Inspection is absolutely important, and something that we should be doing as part of catching these, but we have to find ways of building in the quality earlier before it's actually introduced into the process. Inspection can only make quality transparent. It doesn't actually achieve quality on its own. The fourth point here is one that's a little less relevant in modern software teams. And it was about that mindset of pressuring suppliers just for low costs. Instead, Deming advocated about working with our suppliers as partners in quality, because if they're producing something bad, so are we. And so work with them to improve quality over time instead of just focusing with them on costs. Some of us work with libraries that we license from other people, and so this can be relevant at times. But for the most part, this is one that's probably a little less relevant outside of manufacturing. Number 5, improve constantly and forever. And so before we had continuous improvement as part of our modern agile methodologies, back in the 50s, Deming was talking about continuous improvement to these automobile manufacturers. And over time, he very much advocated that our products and processes should be getting better and better. We should be always inspecting them and looking for ways to improve. This is a never-ending process. We've got to keep a growth mindset for change and continuously look at the best practices in the industry and understand why they're important and how they can apply to us. Next, train for the job. And this is all about making sure that people understand what is expected of them and the unique circumstances of the way that any of you are creating a work environment. How many of us have started a new job and there isn't much onboarding, or the documentation is poor? All of these things are critical for getting people to understand the way work should be done and making them really excellent at it. Number 7, implement leadership. And Deming used the word leadership here in a very specific sense. And to Deming, leadership was about answering that question that we saw earlier during the Red Bead Experiment of by what method. To Deming, leadership was about understanding how those under your care do their work and then providing methods to change the way they work to improve it. Leadership to Deming was about changing the way people work over time. And so he used this phrase in a very specific sense that you'll see come up a number of times, where leadership to him means understanding how things are done and then making changes to improve things. So then number 8, eliminate fear. Again, modern software teams have rediscovered a lot of the principles Deming has been advocating. And I'm sure many of you have seen things like Google's Project Aristotle or Project Oxygen that have identified psychological safety as the #1 most important factor to high performance teams. And Deming felt that this was critical to both the high performance of a team as well as quality. It's important that people aren't afraid of raising their hand when they find something defective. We don't want to be shooting the messenger. We want people to feel safe to raise concerns if they find something going wrong. We want people, as in the Toyota production system, to be able to pull the and-on cord, which stops the whole production line. And if we have a release going out and someone says, like, this is not good enough quality, do they feel safe to be able to raise their hand and stop ship if they feel something is bad enough there? We want to create this environment where people aren't afraid to be raising these concerns, and that is how we get better. Number 9, break down barriers between departments. And so silos are a very old concern in many companies. And Deming definitely saw that in many industries, each manager or each leader would optimize for their local area instead of the global maximum. It isn't enough that we do great at our part of the job. We should be looking between departments and at the handoffs and understand how we can do that better. We should look at things that we're doing that impact, say, the marketing department and how we can work together. The real reason that this becomes important is that to the customer, they don't care about our internal organization, and we inevitably ship the org chart, of course. Deming liked to map out the value chain, the value stream of every single person who touches the product on the way out, and made very clear that the customer was part of this value chain. Deming often used to like to say that the customer is the most important part of the assembly line, and we must always remember that what we're doing always needs to flow to them, and they don't care about our internal organizations. Number 10, get rid of empty slogans. And so just as we saw in the Red Bead experiment, putting up a slogan like quality first doesn't actually make it so. It is a method that makes it so, changing the way the work is done, changing the way the products are sourced. So instead of empty slogans, what Deming advocated for was leadership, and again, changing the way people work. Point number 11, eliminate quotas and management by objectives. And so again, we saw this in the Red Bead experiment, where setting a goal didn't actually change anything because the underlying work wasn't changed to achieve it. And so instead of setting quotas, what we want to do is leadership. We want to change the way work is done to see the improvements that we're hoping to achieve. Worse than just being ineffective or ignored, Deming liked to point out that some objectives can often be actively harmful. If you set a metric for something that is easily measurable and, for example, tie someone's compensation to that, they're going to over-rotate around that objective, and they'll often optimize for that at the expense of everything else. And so trying to hit their goal, they can often, as Deming would say, destroy the rest of the system around them. And so instead, again, what he wanted to advocate was leadership. Number 12, remove barriers to the pride of workmanship. And Deming was very big on making sure that people could be proud of the work they're producing. He felt everyone deserved to have joy at work, and that this would bring out the best in everyone. People want to get better. People want to produce something that they are proud of. And I know from firsthand experience, like engineers that I've worked with absolutely love seeing a feature that they have put their heart into, get into a customer's hand and see them enjoy it. People love this kind of thing. They do want to be proud and create high quality products though. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people where engineers have begged for more time to create unit tests and other things like that that they know they should be creating, but just don't feel like they've been given the time to do it. Number 13, implement education and self-improvement. And so to Deming, we had the previous point, number 6, about training, and that is for the job you have today. Deming also believed that people want to grow and get better. And so we also have to be educating them for the next job and getting even better ahead of what they are doing now. And then the final of the 14 points is making the transformation everyone's job. So quality isn't something that we can hand off to another department. We can't hand that off to a testing department and just say that they're responsible for quality. It is every single person that touches a product that has some responsibility for quality. And when quality isn't there, it doesn't go off to another department. It heads up the chain, and it should be leaders' responsibility to make sure that this is improved. So one way that Deming crystallized a lot of this philosophy was in what he called the PDMA loop. And this was a formulaic way to create change in an organization and was about continuous improvement. So Deming liked to say that management was largely about prediction. And so the first step in creating change is coming up with a prediction of what we think will happen. We should have a method to get there. And before we start anything, we should measure what success will look like at the end. And so as part of this plan step, we are stringing together where we are now, how we will get there, and how we will know when we get there. And it is this tight string of events that he would describe as a plan in the PDSA loop. This is having a theory understanding how that method will achieve a given output. Then next, when we want to start the change, we can do training to bring our employees up to speed on it and then execute it. The next step is studying the results and seeing what actually happened when we have rolled out this change. Did we achieve what we want? Did we achieve part of it? Well, what actually happened? And then finally, we act on this. We either commit the change, roll back to the way we were before, or iterate through this loop again. And it's important that this is a loop that often needs iteration through many, many times, because this is about continuous improvement, not just a one-time thing. You may have also heard of this referred to as the PDCA loop instead of SA. And in earlier versions of this, he had check instead of study, but he felt study more accurately represented the learning and studying what happened rather than just a binary yes, no check about was it successful. So you can kind of summarize this here as applying the scientific method to change. We're doing an experiment with a expected result. We then measure it and then see what actually happens. So it's the scientific method applied to continuous improvement. The next experiment of Deming's that I wanted to share is known as the funnel experiment. And again, this is one that he would do during his 4-day seminars. So here we have a funnel set up that we're dropping a ball through, and it is our goal that the ball lands. It might roll around a little, but we want it to become as centered as possible on the X. So if we do a few runs of this, we might see a fairly tight grouping like this. After all, the funnel was centered around the middle. Deming liked to refer to something that he called tampering. When managers see something going wrong, the first result they often have is to fix it. And so they will try to get their hands in there and try to change something. What Deming warned was that tampering in a stable system is often one of the most harmful things that you can ever do. It is our natural inclination to try to fix things, to step in and try to help, but it is very often the best thing we can do is just step back and let the people who are working on it or know best keep processing in their natural way without this high-level interaction or interruption from above. So in the funnel experiment, if a wise manager saw this variance that was occurring and decided to tamper, maybe what they would do would be, if they saw the first ball land a little to the left, overreact and move the funnel in the opposite direction to compensate. But what actually happens in this case is that leads to a wider error variance because this is a random process and the manager wasn't understanding when they should and shouldn't act. And so tampering can be very harmful. At the end of Deming's life, he saw that a lot of his teachings, like the 14 points, were kind of all over the place. And they represented the totality of what he wanted to teach, but didn't feel that it was a unified theory of what his management method really represented. And so he created the system of profound knowledge that wraps together all of these pieces of his management philosophy into one system. And it was a little arrogantly named. So the different components of the system of profound knowledge are the theory of knowledge, psychology, appreciation, and understanding variation. And it's important to know that this is itself a system of knowledge and that all of these components, parts, interact with each other and overlap. It is by understanding variation that we better get to know the theory of knowledge and psychology and vice versa, so they all intersect with each other. So the first part of the system of profound knowledge that I'll talk about then is a theory of knowledge. And as we mentioned, to Deming, management is largely about prediction. What he saw in many of the American companies that he started to work with in the 1980s during the crisis was that many of them would copy one or two practices from the Japanese manufacturers and then see no results. I'm sure many of us have done the same thing where we've seen companies try to become more agile by adopting something like Scrum, but just putting in daily meetings and using Jira doesn't make us agile. Instead, what Deming thought was critical was having a theory underlying what you're doing as a manager. It isn't enough to introduce one or two management practices. You have to have a theory about how this comes together to achieving the result that you are after. And it is only by understanding the theory that you can create appropriate practices to achieve the outcomes you are after. So we shouldn't just blindly copy a competitor or another company that we see doing well, but have a theory for why it'll achieve what we are after. And that's what the theory of knowledge is about. Next is an appreciation for systems, and systems thinking can be a huge topic on its own. But what a system really is something that where the whole and its relations are greater than the sum of its part. So there's many examples of this all around us. The human body is an example of a system, and you can't understand what it means to be human by decomposing it into just our organs. That doesn't show what it actually means to be humans. Similarly, a society and culture at a company becomes more than just the sum of the individual, but develops its own character. An automobile is a system. It's composed of parts, but those parts become more than the whole when they are all assembled. There's nowhere that you can point to where speed is uniquely identified in one of its parts, but it's how the whole system comes together that achieves these outcomes. One example that I like about this is when the American automobile manufacturers first saw some of these Japanese cars coming across that were so much higher quality than what they could produce. The first thing they did is to decompose them. They took them apart to understand them, exactly against what an appreciation for systems would encourage. And likewise, they were kind of disappointed by what they saw. The Japanese muffler wasn't any better than the American muffler. And so they didn't understand at first why the cars were so much better. Over time, what they came to understand was that it was things like the connection between the parts that made them better. While one muffler wasn't better than one American muffler, each Japanese muffler across a dozen cars had less variance between them. And so they were closer to the same size and fit in better with their connecting parts because there was less variance. Likewise, some of these American cars at the time had 5 different screws of the same size throughout the car because they were produced by different departments that didn't coordinate. The Japanese cars, on the other hand, had one single screw in all these places that was just used 5 times. And so the departments came together across their boundaries to produce something that was greater than just their individual contributions. And so this uniformity again led to better results. Next is an understanding of variation. And so we've seen this a few times in things like the Red Bead and funnel experiment. And to Deming, it was important as managers to know when things were operating within their normal bounds or when there were special causes that demanded intervention. And we should avoid tampering when we don't know what will happen, because that goes against the theory of knowledge. This also comes up with dealing with employees. If one employee's performance is worse one month over the other, we have to ask ourselves, was that really the employee slacking off or not working as hard? Or could this have just been natural variation where there is fluctuation over time in the tasks they are working on and even within the same task itself? And so then the last component of the system of profound knowledge is understanding psychology. And to Deming, it was really important that we understand what motivates people and what brings them to work. When we look at things like stack ranking, Deming thought this was against employee psychology because it created adversarial competition, and it also just focused on extrinsic motivation through money. And we know from many studies that that isn't the primary thing that motivates people. Instead, it is an intrinsic motivation that makes people bring their best to work. And so it is things like bringing pride of workmanship, mastery and getting better at your craft, and these intrinsic pieces of motivation that are the real motivators that Deming felt it was super critical to understand. So that wraps up an overview of Deming's management philosophy for improving quality in teams. And as I mentioned, I think there's a tremendous amount here that is still relevant to modern teams. And it is only by looking at how we can improve the system as a whole that we can have quality as a byproduct. So thank you for all of your time and looking forward to any questions.
Thank you, Steve, for this presentation. It was very nice after listening to 4 other very nitty-gritty presentations that were dealing with very specific types of testing and etc. To hear something more philosophical and remember why we are all doing what we're doing. So let me take a look at the Q&A section. I don't see any questions right now. So we still have, actually we have only 3 minutes in our allotted time. So if anybody is typing, hit enter. I will read the question to Steve. And in the meantime, thanks everybody for listening. This was the last presentation of the day in the print track, and Steve closed it out beautifully. I'll take a look at the Q&A section. No, there is nothing, Steve. Everything was crystal clear in your presentation. When you started it, and when you were talking about Deming and how he went to Japan and about his ideas, one of my main ideas that I got is that sounds very similar to all the Toyota things and Lean. And lo and behold, you then said that he did have a hand in it. So that was interesting. What would you say is like modern day spiritual successors of his management philosophy? I don't mean like actual people, but ideas, frameworks, etc.
I think you can see a lot of what he talked about coming through in modern practices. So the agile software movement was directly influenced, as you're pointing out, by the lean manufacturing movement, and he largely brought that to the Japanese companies in the 50s. So the agile movement is a direct lineage of that. Systems thinking has become very popular in the last few years, and understanding the company as a whole rather than something that can just be decomposed. And so he was one of the early thinkers in that as well. So a large part of what I think he has taught lives on to today.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I see that. One question from Andreas, who says that he has no question. He just wanted to say that he wants to run the funnel experiment at his company, and he says thank you for giving him this idea. And Imantas also asks, what were those 2 American-specific issues Deming noted? Got curious.
The 2 American-specific ones were healthcare and an over-reliance on or liability from lawsuits. So he saw those affecting American industry. As this conference is hosted in Europe, I didn't think those were as relevant. And also they were less something that an individual company can control. In general, he saw them more as societal issues.
Oh, okay. Actually, interesting thing. I always thought about America as this very litigious society, but once I saw statistics that actually Germany and Sweden are much more litigious than America. So here's a fun fact for everybody. Okay, yeah, we're out of time. Thank you, Steve. Have a great the rest of your day, and everybody else have a great keynote speech that is going to happen in 15 minutes from now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.